I'm going to just give an overview of some of the recovery programs that Council currently has underway that they're implementing in their reserves, and then lead on to giving you some tips of things you can do in your own backyards. I understand there's probably people here that have had varying impacts from the bushfire. Some people may have had their properties burnt, others may have more properties in townships, so they might have different specialised needs. So if we can't answer all your questions in this talk, you can come up to our table down the back and we'll try and deal with them down there. So the immediate response to the restoration was to firstly to close the reserves, again to keep the public safe. So falling trees is a major hazard, and so the first response was to go through particularly Mount York area roadways and walking tracks to manage the dangerous and hazardous trees, so that we can then progress to opening up those areas. The next thing we've been doing is putting in stormwater control structures to prevent erosion of creek lines and prevent, conserve the soil and prevent the native seeds getting washed away and damaging our creek lines. So examples of this are rockline channels that we've been putting in. So anywhere there's stormwater outputs and the ends of roads going into our reserves and creek lines, we'll build rockline channels and biofiltration systems. And then along with that, we also, so that's hard engineering with rocks. We also use soft engineering techniques using jute mesh and coir logs. And then we can cover bare soil that's been impacted by bushfire and protect it until natural regeneration occurs, and then the ground cover can start growing back and protect the soil. So it's really important that we are protecting the soil, especially with the recent really major storm events we've had. It's had another major impact on these burn zones with the potential soil erosion and creek line erosion. And weed invasion, yes. A lot of weeds do come down through the water systems, that's right. And there's also other hazards in our burnt areas that we need to tackle. Burnt building materials and also our boardwalks and walking track structures all need to be repaired before we can open up those areas for public access. I did put together a very fancy PowerPoint presentation, which has lovely photos in it, but if you want to have a look at those and come down the back, I've got examples of some of the creekline restoration structures and things that we've been building. So the next part of the recovery process is just allow natural regeneration to happen. So it actually is beneficial keeping people out of these areas for a short time so that the native regeneration, natural regeneration can happen and strengthen on its own before people, and that's council workers in the bush regen team and bush care groups go into those areas to do any kind of weeding. The native seedlings coming up are very delicate and vulnerable to damage, so it's good to allow some time before anyone goes into those spaces for those reasons. So it's best just to sit back and watch the regeneration happening. And species richness can even increase after bushfire, so it's really interesting to watch those things unfold and see what other new species that may pop up that we haven't seen for a while. Acacias are probably one of the first things that will come up there. And then after that, we'll have other things like the ukes and hakeas have popped their seeds and they'll be coming up soon too. So it's all a natural progression of regeneration that it's really hopeful and to see happening. Other areas, you may have been driving out Pulpit Rock Road and you can see the natural regeneration happening. Other areas you may not have been able to access is Pope's Glen because that's all closed off. But even the fern trees and ferns are all growing back and it's looking really green in there, surprisingly, so that's really hopeful. So we've, council has mapped the burnt areas that we're going to unfold our weeding program through, and that will mainly be targeting broom and gorse, which are severely triggered by bushfire events, particularly in the Pope's Glen area and Blackheath, and that will commence between July and September. And that just allows time for that seed germination to happen and then the natural regeneration to strengthen. So moving on to what you can do in your own backyards. If you're residents who've unfortunately had your own backyards impacted by bushfire, the first thing you need to do before doing any recovery work in there is to make sure that they're safe. So if you have any hazardous trees on your property, we advise that you contact council to get advice on how to have those managed. And I will provide you with some phone numbers for you to contact our customer service request team at council. So if you need to tap into that service, you're welcome to do that. Then we'd suggest, if using any available resources you have on your property, rocks and logs, to create habitat spaces for the native animals and also protect soil erosion. So some properties, larger properties, might have flow lines, and you can use fallen trees or trees you've had to fell for stormwater and erosion control structures. We also advise keeping your pets, I guess, out of the yards, particularly cats. If you can keep them indoors, that's the best for the native animals. Always, that's right. And also you can, plant native species in your garden, so particularly acacia, because they're fast growing. They'll create a quick canopy that can then protect the growth of other native plant regeneration. So the Bush Backyard Service scheme operated by council is the best service for you to tap into if you've got, especially if you've got a large property and you need help dealing with either erosion or weed control issues on your property. So you simply need to contact them and they will help you work through a site management plan for tackling those issues, and also just provide other general advice that you might need for getting on top of the situation on your own private property. In terms of undertaking bush regeneration in a burnt area on your property, just like a real specific thing is that you're going to prevent damaging any native seedlings coming up, you use a nice big kneeling mat, because that can then spread the load of your weight if you're kneeling on the ground. And just, again, just trying to protect the native and natural regeneration as much as possible as you move through and do any weeding that you are doing. So then if you are, and just general good bush backyard principles, I guess, is just to remove priority and environmental weeds from your property, particularly broom and gorse and bird spread weeds such as cotoneaster, holly, privet, all those kinds of weeds. Because although the first flush of weeds in burnt areas can be the broom and gorse, there can be a second flush of bird distributed weeds. So they'll be, feeding on that food in the landscape and then dropping it into the burnt zone. And then that can be the next flush of weeds that come up in burnt and impacted areas. So use the compost. Compost your weed material on site if possible, or use the green bins. Never dump your weed waste over the back fence or in the bush, because that can spread weed seeds, and it's just bad etiquette. And prevent your weeds seed or weeds entering any waterways, because as this lady down here quite rightly pointed out, that's the next vulnerable pathway of weed distribution into our natural areas, is through the water system. And I guess then just the other speakers have alluded to anything you can do in your yard to support the native fauna, including the water baths and creating habitat with anything you have, logs and rocks you have lying around, that can help support the native animals, planting native plant species. And again, just keeping especially the cats out of your garden to look after the native animals. And during our vegetation management program of making our reserves safe, we've tried to retain tree hollows wherever possible, because they take a long time to develop and they're the absolute perfect favourite thing for our native animals. They were retained. If any trees had to be brought down, those tree hollows were retained and kept on site. And another idea is to utilise them, stockpile them somehow, and then put them in situ down the track if we can. Smaller tree hollows, perhaps they can be retrofitted and put up in trees rather than building a nest box from scratch. We might be able to use those tree hollows. And just lying logs on the ground, we've been trying to just do that as much as possible in the burnt areas, so there's places for the native animals to take refuge. So then the next most important service, we always obviously bush care. So we want everyone to join bush care. You haven't already, because then you can develop the skills you will need to undertake bush regeneration activities on your own property. And it also allows you to eventually, when our reserves open, you'll be part of a group that can then go into our reserves and do bush regeneration activities in council reserves. Thank you. So you're not really supposed to go into any reserves without being affiliated with a group, which would be, for council, is the bush care group. Being part of bush care is really critical because it helps just build the natural resilience in our bushland to cope with these major events by eliminating as much as possible the threat of weed distribution and impact on our bushland, especially on the edges of our suburban interface, which is primarily where bush care operate. They do remote stuff as well, but in that interface, the stronger and more protected we can make that, the more protected the core is and the core bushland areas. And you'll just keep informed. By joining bush care, you'll keep more informed of events that come up and just, have your ear to the ground on things that are going on and learn more about your natural environment and bushlands. So the council contacts, the key ones are bush care. I've got Sandy Benson and Alison Steele here today. They'll be hanging out down there at their cool store. And give you all the information you need about how to join bush care and also provide you advice on the Bush Backyards scheme. We've got flyers. Please, everyone, grab one of those flyers if you feel like you need the information or you might want to pass it on to someone else who might want to tap into that service. Go to the Blue Mountains website if you need other information on recovering from the recent bushfires, because it's been very stressful and traumatic for the whole community. You might need a whole other range of services we're providing on that website that you can tap into and utilise. And then we'll provide you with the customer service request number. So if you want to contact council in terms of any advice in terms of removing trees on your property, we've got those numbers down there as well. So that's also on the council website, all that information. And then finally, just other extra resources you might want to tap into. We've got more booklets on the new booklet for Weeds of the Blue Mountains down at our table, so you can grab one of those and go to the Weeds of the Blue Mountains website. Wildlife Plant Rescue and the Conservation Society Nursery are good resources if you want to buy native plants to put in your garden. And the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators is also an excellent resource if you want to develop bush regen skills, tap into events that they've got going on, or they've also got a massive program going at the moment where volunteers are joining. They want to help people who are affected by the bushfire and support them in their recovery process as well. So that's just an awesome community-based thing you can tap into.